For many in the Black community, the Chauvin verdict was not just for George Floyd, but for the countless number of unarmed Black men, women, trans men, and women and children who have been murdered. Joining us via Zoom is psychology expert and life coach Dr. Cheyenne Bryant, and it's always wonderful to have you join us. I think it's twice in 1 week. How
We'd love
lucky
to see
are
it.
we?
Good morning, Dr. Bryant.
Because you put things...
Friday.
Yes, happy Friday. You put things in such, really just very important perspective. So thank you again for joining us. So the verdict, and obviously so many of us and so many in the Black community are cheering this on, Dr. Bryant, as a victory, and yet there's still so much pain and so much more to be done. How do you suggest we put this in the proper context, this victory, and yet still pain to contend with?
Absolutely, Giselle. This is the thing. There's micro, macro, okay? This was definitely a victory at a micro level, meaning for the family, which is what we all wanted, right? But at a macro level, for the community, and even bigger than that, for the world, this is just accountability. It's not victory. Again, victory would be us not having to experience these too many Black lives that have been murdered at the hands of law enforcement. That's what victory would be, but unfortunately, that's not an option. And so we continue to fight the good fight, and we call on every single human being who has a heart to join us in this journey of fighting for what is human rights. And as we see, this is not a race fight. This is not a culture fight. This is a human being fight. People across the world came out and marched for this victory for George Floyd's family. We had folks across every race, every culture came together collectively. And that's because we all understand, well, most of us understand that this is a human right. This is not a race right, a group right, or a people right.
And we saw that. I mean, we talked about that here the morning after, that this was truly a reckoning of humanity, a reckoning on systemic racism.
Accountability.
Yeah, accountability. So Black folks, though, I want to talk just a little bit about pathology and the historical pathology that Black people carry. I mean, going back to the Middle Passage of being captured and taken here, over 400 years ago. So it's just innately in us as Black people to have this pathology and to have this deep emotional distress and pain. So just kind of speak on that a little bit for us this morning.
Melvin, the key word is pathology. And history. This has been going on for over 1,400 years. This started in the early 1700s in the Carolinas, and back then it was called slave patrol. Today it's called policing. The mission of slave patrol back in the early 1700s was to establish a system of terror in response to slave uprisings with the capacity to pursue, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners, including, listen to this, using excessive force to control and produce desired slave behavior. One last mission. Slave patrols were allowed to forcibly enter any home solely based on the assumption of protecting runaway slaves. Okay, that happened to Breonna Taylor. All right. Back in the day, they were returning their slaves to their human owners. Today, all they've done was turn Black folks over to the systemic ownership of prison, jails, and law enforcement. And so if you cannot see that as modern day slavery or modern day slave patrol, then I don't understand what you're looking at. Today is policing. Back then it was slave patrol. It's the exact same thing. And because they believe that the system, owns us, in place of a human ownership, the system believes in some law enforcement, not all, because we do have some good cops. My brother is one. But some law enforcement and systems believe they can treat us any way that they want to. And we're still fighting for that human right of not being dehumanized and not being devalued today, 400 years later.
You talk about, modern day, policing and slavery, et cetera. The video of that knee on the neck, many called a modern day lynching before the world. Talk to me about the trauma of re-watching that video, particularly, it impacted any conscious, good-hearted human being, but particularly for the Black community. What trauma does that cause to re-watch that video and have it seep into the soul of who you are?
You know, Giselle, when I was watching the case, and they kept showing it over and over and over again, I actually said to my mother, I said, you know, I can't keep watching
Yeah.
this over again. I'm feeling like I'm gonna diagnose myself in a minute as PTSD
Yeah.
or secondary trauma. I mean, Giselle, it was just it kept breaking my heart over
Yeah.
and over and over and over again. And I say that, you know, this crime in this act and crime, this murder, definitely is surrounded by racism and hate. However, the effects from the residue of what happened, it affects every single human being in the world. And not only is it re-traumatizing every time anyone watches that video, but I also like to think about the good officers, especially the Black officers who are experiencing secondary trauma. And for the Black officers, they have to internalize being Black, meaning they identify with George Floyd on the ground being murdered, and identify with being an officer who wears the exact same badge and uniform as the murderer who was at the hands of George Floyd's life. That's a lot to process. And so, you know, we always talk about the people outside of our Black officers and even our good officers being affected by George Floyd's death and by the death of the ongoing death of African Americans. But I like to also pay attention to our Black officers and law enforcers who have to process secondary trauma and who are constantly having to deal with, you know, I have to be able to relate to both sides, but be fair and just while I process my own mental health and my own emotions. I'm sorry, but that's a lot. That's a lot.
You always put it into such deep and meaningful perspective, because I hadn't looked at it from that lens, but at least it's in the light of day. And as traumatizing as that is, we are at this moment, an inflection point, because we had that video. So much to process, so much pain, but at least we're moving forward. Dr. Bryant,
Thank you, Dr.
are a
Bryant.
genius and put it in
Thank you.
perspective. Thank you.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Enjoy your weekend.
Yeah, you're great. She's great.